When I look back at the PlayStation, there are some games that immediately come to mind. Old school survival horror games like the Resident Evil trilogy or Silent Hill, iconic platformers like Crash Bandicoot or Spyro the Dragon, just games that stand out to me as the most memorable from the platform. And for a lot of people, one of those games that immediately comes to mind is Metal Gear Solid. But for me personally, well, I never played it. Despite everyone telling me throughout basically my entire life that I need to play the Metal Gear Solid games, they've just kind of sat on the backlog, at least until now. So, does Metal Gear Solid live up to all the hype, or is it simply nostalgia from people who played it 25 years ago? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the fourth in a series of videos where I'm playing every Metal Gear game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along in preparation for Metal Gear Delta. And while you don't have to have seen the first few videos in order to enjoy this one, you will be missing a lot of important context about my journey with those games if you haven't seen them. So I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Metal Gear Solid is an action-adventure stealth game developed and published by Konami and released for the PlayStation in 1998. The basic story setup here is that in the year 2005, there is a nuclear weapons disposal facility on an island known as Shadow Moses that has been occupied and taken over by terrorists. But right away in the intro cutscene, we get told that leading this terrorist organization is actually the Special Forces Unit Foxhound, and they are threatening to launch a nuclear bomb unless the United States government hands over the remains of Big Boss, whose body was recovered by them after the events of Metal Gear 2. So Roy Campbell once again pulls Solid Snake out of retirement, sending him in to infiltrate the island and rescue a couple of VIPs. And before we can properly talk about the gameplay itself, we need to talk about the multi-generational leap in technology here. Between Metal Gear 2 and Metal Gear Solid, the franchise took a bit of an 8-year hiatus, with Metal Gear 2 having released in July of 1990, and Metal Gear Solid not releasing until September of 1998. And I've said it before, but the evolution in gaming technology between the years of 1990 and roughly 2010 is one of the most astonishing and rapid evolutions in technology that I have ever seen. So with that in mind, I want to emphasize that with an 8-year gap right at the beginning of that span of time, almost half of that technological evolution took place between the releases of these two games. So because of that, we go from 8-bit sprites to fully rendered 3D models. We go from a top-down 2D plane to a freely explorable 3D environment. And one of the best additions to come from this is the fully animated and voice-acted cutscenes. Rather than reading the text for the dialogue in silence like the previous games, each character now has dedicated voice actors that, for the time, are actually pretty good. A little goofy nowadays, sure, but if you've heard PS1 era voice acting before, then you know that this is better than most games of that time.
I'm the pawn they sent here to save your worthless butt.
And through these cutscenes, we also get interesting action scenes or comedy scenes that wouldn't have worked nearly as well if it was just text on a screen. A lot of people mock the game for having no facial animations and having the characters kind of just nod their heads while talking, but the voice acting does a lot of heavy lifting here, allowing your brain to kind of just fill in the gaps, and by the time you get through the opening, you don't even really notice it anymore. And it goes without saying, but seeing these people move around and actually act out the scene, even if it is fairly limited due to the hardware, lends a lot more believability to every single character, even just the random soldiers around the island. And even when we first set foot on Shadow Moses Island, the game is just a technical showcase right from the start. Not only in terms of visuals and presentation, but also the insane attention to detail throughout the entire game. We start out in this docks area, and the designers made sure to put puddles in here to show players that when you run through a puddle, you'll splash around in it, generating enough noise for a nearby guard to come investigate. And in the next area immediately after this, Snake leaves trails of footprints in the snow, something that most modern games still don't even bother to do. But beyond that, guards will come across your trail of footprints and follow them to find you at the end of it. Putting things like this right at the beginning of the game really feels like the developers communicating to players that every little detail has been fully fleshed out and realized in this world, and thankfully that quality stays all the way through the end of the game. And in this early section of infiltrating the facility, we get to grips with the basic gameplay mechanics of Metal Gear Solid. Stealth is still the central focus here, but things are a little different than the previous games because of the shift to 3D. Firstly, there's the return of the radar from Metal Gear 2, but its range has been drastically reduced compared to that game. Since we aren't using tile-based levels anymore, we've essentially gone from having a large picture of everything in the general area to just having sight of anything that's fairly close to Snake himself. And this works really well to make players much more careful than they otherwise would be, as this combined with the game's fixed camera angles limit your visibility by quite a bit. But along with this, they have included a feature where you can hold one of the face buttons to enter a first-person view and look around the environment. But the catch is that you can't move while in first person, so even this needs to be used pretty tactically. And aside from that, gameplay is exactly what you would expect. You try to avoid the enemy guards' vision cones, you can knock out guards with melee, take them out silently with a suppressed weapon. It basically all works the same as it has in all of the games up to this point. But as we move through this early area, we find an open vent and use it to infiltrate the facility, which feels very familiar for some reason. As we're crawling through here, we eavesdrop on a conversation between two guards, and one of them tells the other that there's an intruder moving through the facility using stealth, as well as that said intruder has already killed 3 people. This is strange because while we are an intruder moving through the facility using stealth, we haven't killed anyone yet, as Snake was sent in with no weapons and is yet to find any on site that he can use, so there must be another intruder completely unrelated to us or our operation. From here, we find our way into the basement, and we find the first of our 2 VIPs in a cell, the DARPA chief. For those unfamiliar, DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, a real research and development agency of the United States government's Department of Defense. The chief reveals to us that the terrorists have access to a new Metal Gear model, Metal Gear Rex, because of course they do. And unfortunately, he was also already interrogated and tortured by the terrorists, leading to him giving up his launch code for the nuclear weapons. He gives us his keycards so that we can access new levels of the facility before suddenly suffering a heart attack and dying right in front of us. We're freed from the cell by a female prisoner disguised as a guard who happens to have just escaped from the cell next to the DARPA chiefs before the 2 of us get ambushed by enemy soldiers. This was the first bit of actual combat I got into during my playthrough, and it feels a lot better than in the 2D games here, but without disincentivizing stealth. Combat is still plenty punishing, and whenever Snake takes damage, he will get knocked to the ground for a few seconds as a further form of punishment, meaning that players are still better off sneaking around Shadow Moses than running around firing at every guard in sight. That being said though, it is super nice to finally be able to shoot in more than just the 4 cardinal directions in a Metal Gear game. After a short shootout, the woman runs off, and with the DARPA chief dead, we need to go find our second VIP, the president of the Arms Tech Corporation, Kenneth Baker. The DARPA chief told us before his heart attack that he believed President Baker was being held in the armory of the building and to keep an eye out for spots in the walls that are a slightly different color than the rest. So while running around the armory, we come across the first secret walls of the game, and these are tutorialized wonderfully. The Metal Gear games have really had their ups and downs with communicating how to find these secrets to players, but this is probably the best of the whole series. Players are told how to engage with the mechanic immediately before using it for the first time, it's required to progress through the game, ensuring that you can't miss it, and having a visually different wall is also the clearest way they've been communicated in the series so far. It's super intuitive, and I'm glad to see that we've turned it back around after the terrible secret walls of Metal Gear 2. But we use some C4 to get through the wall, and this is where we find not just President Baker, but also Revolver Ocelot, a member of Foxhound and the first boss of the game. And man, do the bosses have a ridiculous amount of personality in this game. I'll talk more about the other bosses throughout the video, but Revolver Ocelot is a marksman who believes that his Colt single-action army revolver is the greatest handgun ever made, and he's constantly flipping it around and styling with it. We essentially play a little game of chicken with Ocelot, running around a square room shooting at one another with President Baker being tied up in the center, until a goddamn cyborg ninja comes in out of nowhere, slicing off Ocelot's dominant hand and disappearing again. Ocelot flees, and we're left to speak with President Baker. He tells us that since he never got any sort of formal training regarding torture, he broke very easily and gave the terrorists his launch code as well, but that a female soldier is carrying his card to override the launch, so we should get into contact with her in case the terrorists manage to start the launch sequence. He also mentions that in the worst case scenario, an engineer named Hal Emmerich knows a lot about Metal Gear, so we should find him to figure out how to destroy it if it ultimately comes down to that. We ask him if he knows anything about that ninja that appeared, and he tells us that it's Foxhound's dark little secret, before suddenly also suffering a heart attack, cursing those bastards at the Pentagon before it finally takes his life. At this point, Snake starts to suspect something as both his VIPs suddenly died of a heart attack as soon as he found them, and confronts Campbell to see if he knows anything. Campbell denies having any knowledge about it, and we're forced to just keep moving to prevent the launch. And this is where one of the best parts of the game comes into play. With President Baker's keycard, we have access to all the level 2 doors, and one keycard can finally open all the doors. They've done it, you guys. For the first time in the series, if you have a level 5 card, it can open all doors levels 1 through 5. Gone are the days of reaching a locked door and swapping through all your keys to find the right one, and now we can simply equip our keycard and go through every door we have access to. In my opinion, it shouldn't have taken this many games for us to get here, but I'm just glad we finally made it. Another change that I noticed around this point is that Kojima and his team have taken even further steps to disincentivize item farming. Instead of using load zones to respawn items like in Metal Gear 2, they now seem to be respawning on set timers. This means that you can't just farm up healing items easily by using an elevator anymore, and you now have to just make do with whatever it is that you can find as you move through the game, which helps a lot with the pacing. For the first time in the series, it felt like farming items was completely removed from the gameplay loop, and I can't really express how much of a difference it makes to not suddenly stop what you're doing to farm items for 2 minutes at a time. But carrying on with the mission, we find the female soldier that President Baker mentioned, who turns out to be Roy Campbell's niece, Meryl. She reveals that Shadow Moses is actually a top secret facility for researching the new Metal Gear model, meaning the US government was actually behind the funding and production of it the entire time, and that Foxhound was only supposed to be there for one final test before Metal Gear was formally approved for mass production. Snake tells her to lay low while he continues the mission, but she tells him that she's wanted to be a soldier since she was a little girl, and that she'll be taking a more active role in this mission whether he likes it or not. Continuing on, we get an anonymous call from a man calling himself Deep Throat. Yeah, you heard me right. He calls himself Deep Throat. Snake asks why he's helping him, and he tells Snake that he's just a really big fan of his. Okay. Around this point, we enter a building full of nuclear warheads, meaning that we can't fire our weapons due to the risk of setting one off. So to make my life a little easier, I bring out everyone's favorite item, the cardboard box. And thanks to 3D graphics, this thing has never looked goofier. As I continue to progress, I come across this nightmare hallway full of dead soldiers, which is honestly one of my favorite scenes out of the entire game. At the end of this hallway is a room where I find Hal Emmerich cornered by the cyborg ninja from earlier.
It's like one of my Japanese animes.
The ninja tells us that he's just here to get a fight to the death with Solid Snake. Either we die and he moves on with his life, or we kill him and free him from his own personal hell. I try to shoot at him, but he's literally too fast to hit with bullets, dodging every single one of them. Despite this, I managed to use melee to get some hits in here and there, and after a very long fight, the ninja starts to have an absolute mental breakdown before suddenly disappearing again. And at this point, Snake realizes who this ninja truly is. Gray Fox. He calls Campbell and Dr. Naomi Hunter, who is Foxhound's chief medical examiner, and Naomi reveals that his body was recovered from Zanzibar, revived, and fitted with an experimental exoskeleton before being used as a test subject for various forms of gene therapy. But moving on from that crazy revelation, we speak to Hal, and he tells us that he was led to believe that Metal Gear Rex was made to shoot down nuclear missiles, not launch them itself. He then reveals that his grandfather was part of the Manhattan Project, and his father was born on the day of the Hiroshima nuclear bomb, saying that his family must have the curse of nuclear weapons written into their DNA. Before we leave, he tells us to call him Otacon, short for Otaku Convention, stemming from his love of mecha and anime.
Right.
And this is a great time to mention that this game's pacing is just immaculate. It's hard to express just how much better Metal Gear Solid flows compared to its predecessors, especially when it comes to the backtracking. Backtracking is required much less often than in Metal Gear 2, and the travel time between buildings and locations in general is roughly half of what it was in the previous game as well. Meaning that very little of my time playing this game was spent backtracking, and the entire game took less time to complete than Metal Gear 2 did. Where that game took me just under 10 hours, Solid took me just under 8. And I mention this not just to point out how much time was saved due to the limited backtracking, but also for you to have the idea in your head that this game manages to deliver so much more than its predecessor did, and in roughly 80% of the playtime at that. We meet back up with Meryl in the women's bathroom, which is seemingly a pattern of behavior for Snake.
You've got a great butt.
And Meryl tells us a bit about her background and how she only ever became a soldier to follow in the footsteps of her father, who died in battle during the Gulf War when she was just a little girl. She felt that because of her family's military history, she should join up too, especially since it would help her to feel closer to and better understand her father. We continue on with Meryl alongside us before she suddenly starts acting really strange. And it's not long before Snake realizes that Meryl is being controlled by Psycho Mantis, Foxhound's psychic specialist. And Psycho Mantis is a great way to bring something up that I've completely left out up to this point. In Metal Gear Solid, the old Foxhound that Snake knew and worked for in the previous games is gone, and new genetically enhanced Special Forces members have taken their place. Along with this, the soldiers present on Shadow Moses Island are genome soldiers, the result of soldiers being enhanced using Big Boss's so-called soldier genes. But back to the story, Psycho Mantis uses his control over Meryl against us by using her as a human shield, forcing her to shoot at us, and eventually even trying to make her self-game end. We battle with Psycho Mantis, trying desperately to keep Meryl alive throughout the whole fight before we finally manage to take him down. As he's dying, he talks about his disgust towards mankind's instinct to pass on their DNA and tells us all about his tragic backstory. And there's actually a very sad moment here just before he passes where he asks us to put his mask back on, since when he doesn't wear it, people's thoughts flood into his mind uncontrollably and he wants to be alone in his own world before he dies. And at about this point in the game, I realized just how great the sound design is here. I mean, seriously, every single sound effect in the game is just so damn memorable and iconic, and don't even get me started on the music here. Sound design is probably the most undervalued aspect of game design as a whole, and the designers did such an amazing job with the game's sound that I had to mention it somewhere.
Come on, let's go.
But getting back to the story again, while using the underground tunnels, Meryl suddenly gets shot in both legs by an unseen sniper, forcing us to backtrack to the beginning of the game to find a sniper of our own. But as I mentioned earlier, this backtracking wasn't even all that bad. I grabbed some additional items along the way, and it still only took me 9 minutes to grab the rifle and head back to where Meryl was. When we return, Meryl is gone, but the sniper is still there, and we end up in a long-range duel with another member of Foxhound, Sniper Wolf, who shockingly doesn't even try to dox me. After believing that we won the duel, we go to get answers from Sniper Wolf and find out where Meryl was taken, but instead we get captured by Liquid Snake, the new leader of Foxhound, and by proxy, the terrorist forces present in Shadow Moses. Liquid reveals to Snake that they are actually brothers and that they are in fact the children of Big Boss himself. After monologuing on for a bit, he leaves us here with Ocelot, who proceeds to torture and interrogate us. And this is a great example of something that I absolutely loved about Metal Gear Solid, the way that it ties the story into the gameplay. Rather than just having a cutscene of Snake getting tortured, we instead get a minigame where we need to mash the buttons really quickly to resist, or we could simply press the select button on the controller to give in and answer his questions. And what's funny is that Ocelot straight up tells you that if you die during this sequence, there will be no checkpoints to load back to, and you'll be set back to your last hard save. Meaning there are actual stakes to the minigame itself, as you can't just try it over and over again until you manage to resist successfully. But luckily for us, I played a lot of Mario Party growing up, so I was able to resist the torture no sweat. We get taken back to a prison cell until Ocelot is ready to interrogate us again, and while we're in here, we confront Campbell about knowing more than he's letting on, and he confirms that he knew Metal Gear Rex was designed to launch nukes from the start, and that it's been a secret project of the United States for months. There's then a really strange retcon here where Snake tells Campbell that Big Boss told him he was his father in Zanzibar land just before we killed him. Which, having just played the original release of the game last week, I can confirm that that definitely didn't happen, and it was simply thrown in here for the sake of plot convenience. Snake also notes here that the body of the DARPA chief is in the cell with him, but it's strange because the body is already decomposing even though he only died a couple hours ago. The guard watching over our cell suddenly gets sick and runs to the bathroom, and taking the opportunity, Otacon runs in and hands Snake a keycard that will allow him to escape. So when Otacon leaves, we hide under the bed, tricking the guard into thinking that we've disappeared before jumping him and making our escape. We grab our gear on the way out, and after a few minutes of exploring and collecting resources again, I realized that Ocelot planted a timed bomb in my gear that's set to blow in 90 seconds. I drop the bomb just before it explodes, and this is just one of those little touches that makes the Metal Gear games feel so special. I had assumed that I had gotten out of that prison just fine and was free to move on, but there was a little surprise planted in my gear just to test if I was observant enough to notice it before it killed me. And honestly, if I wasn't maxed out on rations at the time and going through my inventory just to make room for one, it would have killed me. It also speaks to Ocelot's character, with him being prepared for Snake to escape and having a backup plan just in case. And around this point in the game, I started to realize that while I think the method for navigating through the inventory is really cool, and I appreciate the upgrade from full inventory screen to just having it integrated into the gameplay, it started to feel a bit crowded with how many items I had. Trying to equip a specific item quickly started to become a little more complicated, and personally, I think this could have worked a lot better if they had used a little more color coding. There's a little bit of it in the game as is, with rations being green and your keycard being purple, but other than that, pretty much every item in this game is colored red. Having a little more variation in the colors of your inventory could have made quick navigation a little cleaner in the later portions of the game, and it's a small change that would go a long way in terms of player experience. But we make our way back to the tower we were captured outside of, making our way inside and scaling the entire thing through the stairs while on full alert. Another moment that feels like a callback to Metal Gear 2. When we reach the top, we're confronted by Liquid Snake piloting a Hind D, leading to a sequence where we run away from the Hind by rappelling down the side of the tower before crossing over to the adjacent tower and meeting up with Otacon. He asks Snake if he thinks love can bloom on a battlefield, and Snake answers that it can, but when it does, you have to be strong enough to protect those that you love. Otacon seems to take the advice to heart and gets to work on fixing the tower's elevator for us while we make our way up to the roof. And Tower B was one of the rare moments in Metal Gear Solid where it felt like some of the bullshit from the previous games had crept back in a little bit, with these turrets mounted on the walls that are completely unavoidable as you run up the stairs, just guaranteeing that you'll take some damage along the way and maybe burn through a ration or two. But once we get to the top, we get the real Hind D fight, and this is where it really hit me that there's an interesting pattern in Kojima's Metal Gear games. I've hinted towards it here and there throughout the video, but Kojima really likes to repeat set pieces in these games. Things like crawling through a minefield that leads to a tank boss, or fighting a Hind D on the rooftops, or running up a long winding set of stairs while fighting off enemies. There are numerous set pieces that repeat throughout these games, and it almost makes it feel like Metal Gear Solid sits in a weird in-between of a remake and a sequel, having a completely new story and being set after the previous games, but remaking so much of those games' set pieces and gameplay that it feels like the intention was essentially just to remake them. Anyway, we shoot Liquid out of the sky with Stinger missiles, and just in time, Otacon calls us to say that the elevator is working perfectly again. We take the elevator back down to the bottom floor of the tower, and while in here, we get jumped by a squad of genome soldiers equipped with active camouflage, once again, feeling like a callback to Metal Gear 2. We survive the ambush, stepping outside at the bottom of the tower, simply to be ambushed once again by Sniper Wolf. We have our second battle with her, this time wounding her fatally, taking her down for good. And while she's bleeding out, Otacon appears, revealing that he had fallen in love with Sniper Wolf and doing what he can to comfort her in her final moments. And Sniper Wolf's death scene has to be the most emotionally impactful scene in the game for me. Her background is very similar to Gray Fox's, having been born into a war-torn nation, fighting for survival ever since she was young, and feeling that the battlefield is the only place she belongs. And for the duration of the scene, the team even included distant howling, making it feel like the nature of the island is quite literally crying out for her, which is strangely haunting.
Everyone's here now.
Once again, just fantastic sound design. From here, we enter the underground facility, and down here we come across Vulcan Raven, another member of Foxhound. And this has to be my favorite boss of the game. Vulcan Raven is a very large man, able to carry a minigun around with him, and thanks to his senses being finely tuned, he has a much larger vision cone than any other enemy in the game. We can't win the fight through brute force, so we need to outsmart Raven in order to defeat him. Personally, I planted claymores all throughout the arena and used remote-controlled missiles to try to hit him from behind. Eventually, I managed to bring him down, and he has some very interesting comments before he dies. He tells Snake that he and Liquid are not born of nature, that they are men from another world, and that the DARPA chief that died of a heart attack earlier was not the DARPA chief at all, but was in fact Decoy Octopus, Foxhound's master of disguise. He tells Snake that his spirit will always be watching him before letting the Ravens consume his body. Moving further into the facility, we finally come face to face with Metal Gear Rex. Otacon hacks into President Baker's files, telling us that the new weapon developed for Metal Gear Rex allows it to fire nukes from its railgun, meaning that there's no longer a need for long-range missiles to carry nuclear warheads, meaning it can launch nuclear weapons that are completely undetectable by radar and completely impossible to intercept before impact. We reach the control room up at the top of the hangar, and we eavesdrop on Liquid and Ocelot, the only surviving members of Foxhound remaining. They plan to sell Metal Gear Rex's design and data to foreign nations, forcing the US government to either comply with their demands of Big Boss's remains, or risk the knowledge of this weapon leaking to other world powers, which would inevitably force them into a war. They then talk a lot about something called Fox Dye that Liquid says is killing them slowly, and that they need the government to give them a vaccine for it. He then also reveals that he plans to revive Big Boss's dream, saying that from this day on, Shadow Moses Island will be known as Outer Heaven. Otacon then calls us back, telling us that the key President Baker had for canceling a nuclear launch is actually the only key needed for all three of Metal Gear's launch canceling mechanisms, and that we need to change the shape of the key using temperature for each one of them. This leads to some very painful last-second padding where we need to use the key once at room temperature, then backtrack to a colder environment to freeze the key before running back and using it again, then backtrack even further to heat the key up before running back and using it again. While we're doing all this backtracking though, Dr. Naomi Hunter calls us to explain Fox Dye. She explains that it was created as a virus that can target specific people by having their DNA coded into it, then recognizing that person's DNA to activate and kill them. She then also reveals that Snake was secretly injected with this virus before being deployed to Shadow Moses. Snake asks if the virus will kill him as well, and Naomi simply apologizes to him. But once we finish shutting down Metal Gear, it's revealed that we were actually activating it the entire time, and that Liquid Snake had fooled us into activating the launch for him by disguising himself as our old master McDonald Miller and communicating to us via codec for the entire duration of the game. Liquid then explains to us that the Pentagon used us. We were never sent in to rescue VIPs. We were secretly injected with Fox dye to be sent in and spread it to the DARPA chief, President Baker, and all members of Foxhound before destroying Metal Gear for the government. He then also offers further explanation on how they're related, with the two of them being artificial children made from Big Boss's genes. However, they wanted to make the ultimate soldier clone of Big Boss, so they specifically engineered it so that one twin would have all the dominant genes and the other one would have all the recessive genes. This is even reflected in the character designs themselves, with small touches like Snake having darker hair, which is a dominant gene, and Liquid being blonde, which is recessive. As well as that, their names loosely reflect the dynamic as well, with them both sharing the codename Snake, but with the separate Solid and Liquid prefixes. These little details go a long way to make this revelation feel natural and not like it absolutely comes in out of nowhere. Smaller signs were there the entire time, making it feel more like an aha moment than a full-on surprise. Liquid then jumps into Metal Gear Rex, leading to our final battle. We dodge Metal Gear's weapons while firing our own rockets back at it when we get the chance, before Gray Fox appears to help us out. We managed to get a quick discussion in with him, giving Snake the closure he needed after Zanzibar, before Gray Fox ends up sacrificing himself to weaken Metal Gear, giving us a direct shot at Liquid in the cockpit. We continue to battle until Metal Gear finally explodes, leaving us victorious, even if it does knock us out temporarily. When we wake up though, we realize that we've been stripped of our gear and tied up by Liquid, who somehow survived the explosion and who also reveals that Meryl is lying just behind us, next to a bomb that's set on a timer. Liquid doubles down on what Big Boss had said to us at the end of Metal Gear 2, with Snake enjoying battle and war even if he says otherwise. He explains that because of their shared genes, all the genome soldiers on the island are technically their brothers as well, and that Snake has been killing them without thought since he arrived. He also explains that before the two of them were born, there were actually 8 children of Big Boss, but 6 of them were aborted so that Snake and Liquid could both be as strong as possible, making them killers before they were even born. We fight with Liquid on top of the destroyed Metal Gear in what has to be one of the manliest duels I've seen in my entire life, before we finally knock him off the top of it, killing Liquid and saving Meryl before the bomb blows up. We get a call from the Secretary of Defense telling us that the island will be hit with nukes momentarily in order to cover up what happened there, meaning we need to escape immediately. Snake calls Otacon to tell him about the nukes and ask how they can escape, and Otacon states that he's going to stay behind to ensure that Snake and Meryl are able to make it out safely. So the two of us run to a garage where we're able to steal a car, and we get this really great escape sequence where we use a machine gun on the back of the car to defend ourselves while Meryl drives us out. And even though the draw distance is really low here, it is really impressive that the team was able to get this section working on the PS1 with the amount of assets being streamed in and out of the game's memory in such a short amount of time. As we're escaping though, Liquid shows up driving his own car, somehow having survived once again, chasing us through the tunnels while returning fire at us before we both end up crashing at the end of it. Snake and Meryl both get stuck under their car, but Liquid manages to hobble over to us, and just before he's about to shoot Snake, he suddenly dies of a heart attack. Foxdie finally got to him, even though with how quickly it killed everyone else, you would think he would have died back in the interrogation room, but at least Snake and Meryl's lives were saved by contrivance, I guess. We then get a final monologue that essentially explains the central theme of the game, with DNA being used as a stand-in for destiny. The game is all about forging your own path and doing what you want in life rather than feeling like you're being controlled by fate. Liquid felt like his path in life was set in his DNA, with that path inevitably killing him, but Snake rejects that legacy and forges his own path, allowing him to control his own destiny. Snake and Meryl ride off into the sunset, with Snake technically being a fugitive now, but with the two of them moving on to their new lives, and the credits roll. But the story isn't quite over yet. We get one final post-credits discussion with Revolver Ocelot making a call to an unknown voice. In this call, he confirms that he succeeded in his mission to retrieve the Metal Gear Rex data. He then essentially tells the audience that there is actually a third twin of Big Boss outside of Solid and Liquid Snake, referring to this man as Solidus, before then dropping this bomb.
Goodbye, Mr. President.
Overall, in case you couldn't tell, I really enjoyed my time with Metal Gear Solid. The gameplay feels better than ever, the story feels so much more interesting than it ever has before, and the post-credits scene has me wanting to play the next game as soon as possible. And compared to most games that try to imitate a cinematic experience, Metal Gear Solid never forgets to be a video game. Something that a lot of modern game studios could probably spend some time studying. But at the end of the day, I'm going to give Metal Gear Solid a 9.4. And that's another video in the Metal Gear journey down. Thank you for stopping by for another video, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. The fact that you guys keep coming back really motivates me to continue on with the series and see it through to the end, so seriously, thank you for watching all the way through. If you guys are interested in supporting the channel financially, consider checking out becoming a channel member or a patron. It really goes a long way in helping me put as much time as possible into these videos, and I can't thank you guys enough. If you want to check out the other videos in the series, you can find them right here, and maybe even check out another series we've been doing recently here on the channel, reviewing the Ace Combat games. But until next time, I'll see you guys right here for the next Metal Gear review.